gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the Business Virtual Atajo. I think this is the third one we've done this series, which is really exciting. And we're going to be talking about, as Lois put it to me, it's the 3 ways in which LVD discusses how to use the offhand weapon, the Dagger, and how there's some similarities, but there's a lot of contradictions as well. So she's going to be exploring that. And most exciting for us is she's actually completed a translation that she's offered up to people. So you may want to pull that up if you're on a computer or a PC and ask questions, because that's a new one that's kind of come out just this week. So
yeah, actually, no, that's going to come out next week. I got delayed.
Okay.
But that's okay.
Early preview for lucky people.
Yeah.
So how do I introduce Lois? Well, I thought the most appropriate way to introduce Lois was actually to share a personal story of the first time I met Lois, which was actually at a mega game. So Lois was on a team. She kind of showed up and was put with a team of like these weirdly well-dressed dudes who looked like they walked straight out of the American Psycho set. It was really odd.
Yeah.
She was in charge of their war campaign, so she was like the general, and I was on an opposing team, and we were talking and everything, and Lois was kind of like doing little maneuvers and stuff, and our particular team was doing pretty well in a lot of other areas. On the very last round, Lois managed to do something that kind of like completely upset all of our plans. And I just was like, damn, very impressive. And then one of the very first night that I went to business, reconnected again, and she was one of the first people that I met, and she is always a friendly face at our school at business. She's a huge part of the culture there, and she obviously offers a lot in terms of her personal time, in terms of translating things. So very, very warm welcome to Lois, who's going to take us through tonight's session.
Thank you. That was an incredibly kind intro. Thank you, Eddie. So this is super informal. This is the rough, crumbly core of a workshop that I had intended on doing at FOTS this year. But when all these different things got canceled, other stuff took over my head. So I never really quite completed the workshop. So you're going to see something that's, it's the heart of, I think, 2 or 3 things that I can end up talking about. But right now you're seeing almost like a work in progress. You're seeing something that's maybe 75% baked. And the reason I'm happy to share it with you is because you may have, it's like I can't see the forest for the trees. You may have really good insights that will help me maybe sharpen or focus the presentation itself, or you may have questions that I hadn't even thought about, which are important to cover. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen, which means I'm going to take over your monitors. It's a PowerPoint, but I'm hoping it's not a boring PowerPoint. It's a pretty straightforward one. So the original premise was back in September, when Sean and I were lucky enough to go to WMAW, when we were chatting with Puck Curtis and with Eric Myers, they were doing a lot of stuff with Tejedo. Now I'm going to say Tejedo. I think it's probably easiest for us to shorthand him as Tuxedo. That's, I mean, we call Figueiredo Figgy, and Vietnam's easy enough, but I think we can call Tejedo Tuxedo, or Tex, whatever you feel like. And Tejedo, the cool thing about Tejedo is that he's this author out in Naples, which is under Spanish control at that time, and he's put together this document, which is it's basically a primer to teach Spanish fencers how to beat Italians. And it's written with columns of text side by side. Here's your Spanish, here's your Italian. We'll get a bit more onto that document later, but in researching that document and in taking a look at Dagger, it really struck me that we've got Like I was already familiar with Figueiredo. He's got a very particular way of looking at Dagger. I was sort of familiar with Viedma because I'd seen it on London Longsword, and I chatted a little bit with Dave about it. And Tejero, I ended up reading on the flight home, and I was struck by how different they are. And in some cases, like one author will actually call another style out. But if you look at them from fundamental Destreza principles, they are all kind of legit. It just depends on what your philosophical, your central philosophical principle is for defending yourself with an offhand weapon. So I hadn't paid attention chronologically to how these guys were aligned. I just knew that I wanted to tackle Figgy first because I know him reasonably well, and I wanted to tackle Viedma because he's kind of in between Figgy and Tejero, and then I wanted to tackle Tejero because Tejero calls out Viedma's style. But it turns out that that's the critical order. So, without further ado, let me see if I can actually call up my presentation. There we go. So, I have Figueiredo's Filosofia in 1628. His central theory of offhand weapons is use sword as if you didn't have the offhand. You want to rely on your single sword skills at all times. When you do use the dagger, you want to use it as an extended quillion. Now, I'm not getting up to show anything to you because on the next slide, I've got some pictures that I have at least one picture here that we're going to look at. So the dagger in this case is considered an extension of the quillion. It's used to trap your opponent's efforts to get around your blade. And to Figueiredo's philosophy for offhand weapons is that the purpose of any offhand weapon is to deny an area of space to your opponent, to tangle them up, to slow them down, to force them to make larger circles and buy you as much time as you can earn from them. So Figgy has a very specific way of doing things, and it's pretty funny. He spends about a paragraph going, now listen, what I'm going to tell you to do is strange and weird, and I'm betting you've never seen it before, but if you just try it the way that I tell you to try it, you are going to think it's the most gosh darn awesome thing you have ever seen, and you're going to love it, and you're going to sing its praises. And like, I'm being a bit hyperbolic, but not completely. So in terms of the technique, you're supposed to have your arm out in a right angle guard to start with. And then your dagger blade is held very close to the guard of the sword. And you want that dagger blade to be at 45 degrees against that sword along various angles. I think Sean is demonstrating. So if you can see Sean on your screen, he's showing how that looks.
Switch over to me. You can see that we're in the right angle, and the dagger is 45 across and 45 forward.
So just as Sean is demonstrating us in 3D, thank you, because I don't have room to do that. We can see in this image, which actually comes from Comprensión de Destreza, which is in 1681. We can see an example that's something very similar to that, that the left-handed fenter is using, that same idea of the dagger operating as an extension of the quillion or denying an area of ease of movement for the opponent's blade. So, before I continue, do people have questions about Figgy Dagger? I'm going to give it a little extra time because some people might be writing in the chat, and I want to give them a moment.
Excuse me, Lois.
Yeah.
With that illustration there, so the one on the left, that's the Spanish posture, and the one on the right, Italian posture. Is that right?
Correct. Yes.
Okay. So the one on the left is the one that Sean's demonstrating, the one you're talking about, whereas the one on the right is potential Italian opponent.
Yeah, and the one on the left's got an acute angled blade, which is moving out of the right angle, but you use that for attacking. And that also covers up broadens the area that you've covered. So you're like spreading out so that you can cover higher and lower as well. That tends to be in the thrust, you'll thrust under their weapon and so forth.
So the way I understand things, and I'll admit Figueiredo is not my favorite style of dagger because I still have a hard time getting my head around it. That dagger up position is what you use when your blade is being subjected, because you can use that dagger to deviate the opponent's blade should it start to come in on you. But if you have an atajo where you're subjecting your opponent's blade, then you want to drop that dagger. And you see how this guy has the dagger, it's a bit vertical for what we do, but he would be dropping it so that the dagger point would be, Sean will show you what that dagger point looks like when it drops. Yeah, that's what happened if you put somebody in an atajo, because if they're going to try to disengage underneath you and you've stepped into the medio proporcionado, then they're going to get locked up in that dagger and you're good to go.
Once again, you're opening up the angle too, so that you've got more area covered.
So Figgy is all about maximizing the quillions and that central hand area of defense, really maximizing the operation of the guard. Do we have any other questions?
Nothing in the chat yet, but I'm sure some questions will come through.
No problem. Are we ready to move on to Viedma?
Yeah, I think Figgy's the one that most of us are familiar with already. So
yeah. All right, so onward to Viedma. So Viedma also talks about using the sword and dagger and operating with the sword as if you didn't have an offhand. And the dagger remains chambered. It's ready to use to deviate the opponent's oncoming sword, but then returns to its place as soon as possible. It'll impede the opponent's sword when viable, and is used to strike the opponent if a movement of conclusion situation appears. So in this version of using the dagger is nowhere near the guard of the sword. You actually keep it sort of resting against your chest, and the dagger blade will come up the sword arm, not even at the elbow. It'll come out above the sword arm. It'll come out between the elbow and the shoulder of the sword arm. And you just sort of leave it there because that allows you to stand in a much more profiled stance. The Figgy dagger does require you to stand a bit squared so you can bring that offhand weapon to your sword guard. And that forces some changes in the way that you do things. So with Viedma, he's all about, you know, if the opponent should put their sword blade within reach of your dagger, then you control with the dagger and you strike with your sword. If the opponent keeps working away from your dagger, then you control their sword with your sword and enter into basically a movement of conclusion, except instead of grabbing the opponent's hilt, you're stabbing him in the face. Or whatever is easy to do. And this is what that looks like. Now, this is a great photo from London Longsword. And here we see these two practitioners in front of us probably both started from the Viedma stance. In fact, I'm almost completely certain they started from the Viedma stance. So the person on the left is still very much in that Viedma stance. That's where you want your dagger to be when you're at rest and you're fighting. He's currently saving his life by tilting his hand out to move that sword point off his face. But she has moved in and she's not only controlled his sword with hers, but she's also controlled his sword with her dagger. Now, that's just a photo of an exercise that's at its point of conclusion. But down here, you'll see this inset, and this inset comes from Tejedo, which is our third author. And you can see the fencer on the left is the Spanish fencer. And you can see where that dagger point comes out. It's very, very high up on that arm. So the idea is if you're fighting, you're managing everything as much as possible with that sword. And should your sword be subjected with, Viedma talks a lot about being under the line and the cross, and your weapon starting going to a weak under strong. Then once your opponent's moving in to strike you, leaving to strike you, as he says, then you've got that dagger ready to stop the point from coming into you, and then you can liberate your own sword to strike. Do we have any questions?
Yeah, I've got one about the size of the dagger. So Figgy says you should have a short dagger that's 2 palmos length, which we all know.
Yeah.
Nice and short like this. Viedma says you should have a long dagger that's at least half a vara. Isn't half a vara 2 palmos? We've got 5/4 vara for our sword, and that's actually 5 palmos.
Yeah. At this point, I've confused myself, so I can't give you good numbers. But what I do understand from the way they've talked about the sword and daggers is that a Viedma dagger should be a third longer than our Figgy dagger, is what I understand. And it's the same thing with the Tejedo dagger. So if you take a look at your Figgy dagger, and then you imagine that being 2/3 of a longer dagger, yeah, that's about what you're looking for. And the reason that you can't use a longer dagger with Figgy is because you will get tangled up in your arm. As you're trying to change position as you're trying to bring your dagger from high to low, it takes much longer for a longer dagger to do that action. Do we have any other questions?
None at the moment.
Cool. Okay. Are we ready to move on to Tejedo?
Sure.
Excellent. All right. So Tejedo is 1678. So very quickly, Viedma 1639, right? Figueredo 1628, Viedma 1639, and Tejedo is 1678. That is a significant amount of time later. However, Tejedo's is similar to Viedma's. You want to keep that dagger back and ready to go. You don't want to compromise the profile of your own body. The dagger remains in its place all the time until in that moment it's deviating the opponent's sword. When I say deviate, I mean it's pushing the opponent's point to one side or the other so that it doesn't strike you. It's not moving the point above you. It's not moving the point down. Down would be a subjection closer to an Atajo. Now, the interesting thing is, to go back to this earlier photo, the reason that this picture is in Tejedo's book is because Tejedo is very critical of this rear placement of the dagger. When it comes to technique, I was being silly. I was a little tired, but I'm not kidding about all hail the equilateral triangle. We'll come to that, but man, don't mess with that equilateral triangle. No, seriously, don't decompose the triangle. Don't do it until the opponent attacks. And then there's some responses that you have depending on how the opponent is approaching you and what's happening with their weapon. Now, the interesting thing to keep in mind about Tejedo is that although he's talking about destreza in general, his impetus is about defeating the Italian. So I hear somebody typing.
I'm taking notes.
Oh, cool. So
Brian's
here
just
we have.
Sorry, Lois. Ryan's just in the chat that he can confirm a lot of Tuxedo's text revolves around that triangle. So he just wanted
to. Thank you. So here are 3 images from Tejedo. Tejedo actually has quite a few plates, which is really nice. And here again, we see that we see a continuation of that idea. Here's that that Viedma placement of the dagger very far back. And the reason Tejero dislikes this so much is because you are not protecting your lower line. If you notice, I'm looking at my screen with my finger, which is useless. Let me get my mouse pointer. If you notice, the sword has probably circumvented from below and has struck. You can see this poor dude's bleeding, has struck underneath the dagger. So the dagger was leaving a line open which was never intended to be open. So when we talk about the equilateral triangle, this is the equilateral triangle that he will not shut up about. He says that very specifically, when you hold the dagger, you want to have your arm in a right angle guard and then bring it into a mixed angle where your arm is acute and your sword is obtuse, so that your sword is pointing at your opponent's left eye. I mean, he gets specific. And then your dagger should be held in such a way that it should be held about a fist away from your body, fairly low, between your diameter, which is basically the line that vertically goes through your sternum, and then your right collateral if you're a right-handed fencer. And that collateral is basically where the arm meets the body, a vertical line that drops right down where the arm meets the body. So you want that hand to be between these lines. And once that hand is between those two lines, you want to align the dagger so that it points to the upper quillion of your sword. And by maintaining this triangle, you have protected all of the important lines that any obnoxious Italian could possibly try to get on you. As illustrated in this third image here. So this is in theory what would happen if an Italian were to try to strike at you. The assumption is you can see his feet. You can see the Spaniard's feet. He has made an inside transverse, which is why that dagger is effective in protecting him, because he's changed the alignment of his body and he's also changed his position relative to the Italian fencer, who has now taken some steel in the eye socket.
He's
now,
raised his arm
just as a
the angle too,
what's that?
So he's raised his
what?
arm back into the right angle as well.
Mm-hmm.
I've got another comment here from Martin as well. It says, is protecting the low line such an important thing if you maintain the right angle, given that lower targets are further away? Maybe my definition of low is different.
Yeah, so that's a good point. A low target is anything sort of honestly, from the nipples to the waist. It's the lower torso that you have to worry about, and Tejero doesn't expressly say it. I can call up some other pictures in the translation in a bit, but it has to do with the fact that Italians will get lower when they strike. So that's actually a very upright attack from the Italian. In some cases, they will actually be much lower and may have obviated the sword with their dagger. So you have to have something protecting that sort of that belly, I guess. You're not really worried about a strike to the legs. You're not worried about a strike, certainly from the hips down, probably not even the waist down. But I think that's a very specific response by Tejero against the kind of attacks that will happen with Italians who will drop their level when they strike at you. You know, if they're lunging, just because of the openness of their feet, they're going to end up lower than they would if they were standing upright with their feet closer. Did that answer your question?
Yes, it did.
Awesome. Okay. This is all I have on the PowerPoint, but I do want to note very briefly before I forget, I completely forgot that I translated a bit of Rada when it came to Dagger. And Rada's method of holding the dagger matches Tejedo's, which is really interesting. So Tejedo is 1678, Rada's 1705. This is my loose and fast translation from about 2 years ago. Hold the dagger arm in such a way that it forms a curved line, and that the front half of it, from the inside of the elbow to the hand, is in front of the profiled body from the left collateral line to the right collateral line, with the hand itself half a Spanish foot away from the body, and at the height of the 6th horizontal plane of the body, which is found between the chest and the waist. The guard is in front of the enemy, and the blade forms part of forming part of the high rectitudinal line, with the point aimed at the tip of the upper quillion of the sword. And in this posture, you can, in front of your right collateral plane, diagonally cut or entangle as many real or imagined lines that your opponent might attempt to employ. So that was Rada. That was Rada proper. If folks are interested, we can take a slightly closer look at Tejedo, because I've got some other images in the PDF file. Would people like to do that?
Just before we move on, that one in
Yeah.
the top left with the word Tejedo on it, it's showing
Yeah.
the blade in the acute as well, stabbing him in the knee. Is that what I'm looking at?
Yes. Okay. So that comes out of, yeah. So that's a good point. This image shows a response that, it's basically showing two responses to two different postures. So this is how you would arrange yourself to deal with an Italian. And if the Italian were to try to snag yours with their dagger, then you would simply drop your, you basically do a half circle first. You would drop your sword, making a circle in a curve in the form of a backwards letter C to strike at the Italian, avoiding their weapons.
So Vienna says something similar to that with one of his, I think it's actually counter to the buckler, but he's saying that if the opponent moves their weapon below, moves the buckler below their arm to defend out your first attack, then you should just stab them in the calf, which
Yeah.
I always was fairly extreme, but this seems to be the same sort of idea going on there. Also,
And
does the Italian have the right foot forward or the left foot forward? Are his arms attached to it, or what the hell is that?
this is an excellent question, because I think the poor artist got confused and was drawing a figure with his back to us, and then realized he couldn't. He needed a figure with his front to us. So as far as I understand it, it's a withdrawn guard, so the dagger leg is forward and the sword leg is back. But yeah, that illustration is painful. There are also a bunch of other quirks.
If you look at his back foot, the foot's turned as if it's the left foot.
That's true, and that could be the case. I don't know, and I don't think the captions are clear on how the Italian is standing.
Yeah, and I'm just feeding off the circle too there. You can see sort of like it's got the normal placing circle that you can see, and I'm guessing that's indicating that his front foot is outside normal stance. You've got a bit more space, you see. So I'm kind of inclined to think that is his right foot forward, but then his arms are attached on the wrong shoulder.
Right? It's I'm not sure how to read that illustration. I'm really not.
I've got a question from Julian. He said, why is the Italian leaving himself open like that?
I believe it's because that image is depicting the Italian in the middle of an action. It's not in a guarded position. So I think what the Italian has done is that image shows the Italian having subjected the Spaniard's sword with the Italian's dagger, and shows you the option that the Spaniard has in responding to that.
And so Martin's added Marcelli.
So yeah, that's I believe that top left image, that is the fencer with his right foot forward and then his left arm retracted. Sorry, his right arm retracted back and then his left hand out in front.
Yeah.
Oh,
Cool.
as-
That's what I've seen too. Oh, okay. So the body's twisted, and we just can't see the twist. In the body.
Yeah. So he ends up.
Yep.
okay.
His dagger
Yeah,
out here, and then his sword
Cool.
still held low.
He's
Thank you.
looking forward to take with the dagger.
Yeah. So to take with the dagger and then lunge without having to do a passing step.
There we go. Cool. Thank you.
That hurts my brain.
Oh. Yeah, I need a chiropractor just thinking about it.
Yeah.
All right.
We see it quite a lot in our stuff too. Not maybe with Brisbane Swords Tuesday night have similar ones as well. Not too different.
So Ryan said in the text it's named as Fiancata or Guardia Luna, isn't it?
Well, no, those are two different things. The Fianconata is a particular guard, and the Guardia de Media Luna, the Mezzaluna guard, is a different guard. I'm hoping we've got some more Italian able folks to help out there. But.
Yeah, and then Ryan says, which I think Marcelli has it in his lingo as well.
Cool. Yeah, because I think what we're seeing here with Tejedo is the early iterations of what ends up being the Neapolitan style, where these factors all mix together in a delicious soup, and we end up with a Neapolitan style. All right, so that's the foundation of the presentation. One of the things that I found really interesting is that if you're settling in on your destreza principles, which are you want to be protected before you attack. You want to make sure that your lines are covered. Well, there's not just one single right way to do that, and these dagger techniques kind of prove it, because if you read the justifications that each author writes for these positions, for their various dagger arrangements, well, they actually are adhering to the destreza in their own particular way. So if I were doing this as a workshop, I'd be asking people, well, which dagger approach works best with what you're doing? Which ones appeals more to you? Which do you think would be more interesting to try or more effective for the way you do things, whether you're a Spanish fencer or not? And separately, I think it would be fun to sort of make arguments for how we use our daggers if we don't use a dagger in the way any of these guys do, and try defending it from a destreza standpoint, because I suspect in many cases we could successfully do it.
We also have who's it, Figgy? He's basically talking about the Viedma dagger position, and he says that, right, if you're an established diestro, you're quite happy like this. You just keep it here, make sure you don't compromise the profile, and you just use it when they come in and see extreme. Whereas he's sort of saying, yeah, to get it in the play, let's get it out here, actually get active with it. But if all else fails, just go back to this. This is fine for destreza, but you can do better.
Yeah, he actually uses the term lazy, I think, or something similar to describe that method of holding the dagger. It's like, yeah, you can just sit there with the dagger resting against your chest and do whatever you like. But if you want to make real use of it, here's what you can do.
Which coincides with his take on Bracer as well, where he goes, oh yeah, both diestros will tell you just to leave it here and wait for them to overcommit their action before you're using it, whereas Figgy's all about getting their Bracer in and taking over.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Figgy is very much about getting those offhand weapons in and forcing your opponent to do things they don't want to do, like entangling, interrupting, being obtrusive, which means going into attacks. Like if you've got an attack coming, to to your offhand side. Your job is to get in there, which is scary.
And that sort of feeds into Vietnam talks a lot about moving towards the threat, going against some natural reactions and that sort of stuff. So that seems to feed well into being discursive.
All right. Do we have any specific questions? I've got the PDFs open, so I can grab the Tejedo Dagger translation. I've got my Oplosofia translation. I've got Tim's translation of Viedma. So if we wanted to examine anything in particular, I can find something.
Got at least one play that I know we've been over a few times. Is that worth going over? That's that the disengage that you were just talking about. Do you want to sort of talk that through in its entirety? Anybody else is interested?
I'm happy for you to tackle it because I don't have the space.
I'll just read you if you want to read it, and we can walk it through.
Okay, so which one do you want me to read?
People want to hear specific plays. If Tuxedo has them, or
Tejedo doesn't have any, but I can read some of the stuff around those pictures. So, for instance, in the image, I will.
Ryan's requested page 80.
Page 80 in the Tejedo translation.
Ryan, if you just want, yes, he said yes.
Okay, give me a second. I'll go there right now.
Yeah, while you're looking that up, I'll just let you know, Jacob also had a comment. He said that that blade was stabbing that figure on the left, right, or was it deflected to the dagger's outside?
Oh, I don't know which image he was talking about, but we can tackle that in a moment.
Sure.
So page 80, I will share my screen, although it's probably going to get annoying in a moment. But page 80, I'll just regularly share my screen. Page 80 is the one in the Tejedo translation, is the one that has that image with the equilateral triangle of never breakness. Don't break this ever, ever. And the interesting thing is, even though this book is written in Italian and in Spanish, these captions, if they're written in the image, they're only in Spanish. So the translation, actually, no, I don't think I can do that. So the translation for what's going on in this image, where we see that sword drop, is here. How to oppose the Italian who is in the fianconata guard. If the opponent were to adopt the mezzaluna guard, covering the face, oppose them by lowering your sword to the acute angle, and if they should impede your thrust with their dagger, take advantage of the natural motion you just made and circle your sword around the dagger in the form of a backward C and strike the opponent in the face. And if in this tempo they thrust at you, impede it with your dagger, which is why the triangle has been made with it while your sword strikes the opponent. So the idea being that so I think this is the fianconata guard, and the mezzaluna would have the Italian changing foot positions. I'm speculating there, so I'm going to need somebody to correct me if I'm wrong.
Okay.
And the idea is that, yeah?
This one here, isn't it? Where we've got the half.
Yeah.
This is getting to, I don't know if you can see my feet. No, too high.
That's all right.
With the right hand is withdrawn with the left hand forward, but my right foot still forward. And
cool.
You can see how he's then saying, they come from this Luna and then go to take your blade with their dagger. They sort of open up.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, so if
get in the middle, in my face, it's always sounds fun. And if I counter with this, then that's going to hit your triangle to deviate the outside.
Yep. Was that what you wanted to go over, Ryan, or is there anything more specific you wanted to tackle?
That was pretty much the one that I wanted to. So you basically say them almost let them take your blade with their dagger,
Yeah.
curve around with the C, and thrust to the face, and use this to deviate anything that they tend to do.
Yeah, but the thing is, you don't go to your outside, you go to your inside. Take a look at how his feet are arranged.
Oh yeah, that's right, isn't it? So it's like he takes my dagger, I do this reverse C and
Correct.
gap between his weapons, and that'll
Yeah.
actually reduce this area here. And you see there
Yeah.
that the lower area here might be more important for him to have the dagger sort of able to
Yeah.
cut that out with that triangle, rather than like if I'm over here, it's pushing out.
Yeah.
What do you
Ryan said that's what he was after.
Awesome. Okay. I'm glad we were able to tackle that.
Jacob's question referred to the slide where you had the three plates.
Yeah, give me a second. I'll bring that up.
I'm pretty sure that's the one that
Go.
Lois, you can see blood coming out of him.
Yeah, you can see him right here. He's so yeah. The answer to your question on that one, Jacob, is that the sword would be between the Spaniard's torso and the dagger. He's the Italian sword has come in between the Spaniard's sword and dagger, and has basically struck. As far as I understand, it would be sort of around the armpit of the dagger side, because boy, howdy, is that hard to defend.
So he's saying this
Like
is
if you've
to the what is it? The Edmund dagger guard. So when I've got the dagger quite far back like this, you can see there by that camera angle, you've got all that meaty lung that you could
Yeah.
right through.
Yeah.
I presume that's where he's talking about, is it?
Yeah, so yeah, like for you, Sean, if you're using the Viedma guard and you've got a clever Italian on you, they're going to hit you in the floating rib on your sword side before you can cover with that dagger.
Yeah, because if I've got it here up over my arm already, it's much harder to sort of shut out anything down there. As opposed to if we've got this triangle where I'm pointing to my wounds and it's already out there, that can move freely around this sort of area, even almost staying in that triangle. Hi, Henry.
Yeah, honestly, that I can't help but wonder if the torso, the line of the equilateral triangle formed by the torso, isn't a moving line. Like, you know, the arm is very much like a two-dimensional line, and the dagger itself is like a two-dimensional line, but maybe the torso itself is a parallelogram, as he talks about it in the text, where you can change the orientation of your equilateral triangle and still have it be an equilateral triangle as long as your chest, storm, and dagger are in alignment. That would be something we'd have to play around with to figure out. But, you know, I can't help but think about it.
Lois, I have a question.
Yeah.
You've taken us through three different authors. And I was wondering, in your opinion, is it the emphasis on the form that guides how the dagger is used, or is the emphasis on the function of the dagger, or is it somewhere in between?
Yeah, that would take a lot more thinking, because as in all science and arts at this time, you have form informed by function, function informed by fashion, fashion informed by form. So to get a sense of why, for instance, Rada's method of holding the dagger is very much Tejedo's, I'd have to do a whole lot more research on Rada's historical circumstances and on Tejedo's historical circumstances. And just off the top of my head, I think it's very telling that Rada's method of holding the dagger matches Tejedo is because Tejedo was part of the Neapolitan kingdom. He was down in Mediterranean Spain, but Rada, he's originally a Spaniard, but he spent a deal of time in the New World. He was the Viceroy of Veracruz, which is now a state in Mexico. So, you know, what does that say? I don't know.
It's also
Also,
lot of techniques in Rada that seem to be leaning towards the Neapolitan. You start to see their photo lunge. You see a lot more of the engagement from underneath, and
And to sort of come back to what Eddie was asking, we also have to think about it in terms of, like, we can go all the way back to Pacheco on this. Carranza established a philosophy of a way of life, and he used it through the lens of fencing. And by doing it through the lens of fencing, he actually established a rubric for fencing that then Pacheco ran off with. Now, originally Pacheco was very pro Carranza, but once Pacheco started getting enough notoriety and fame among the nobility in the courts, he began to turn on Carranza because he wanted to make a name for himself based on his own merit. So not only do you have this idea of, are we doing this for the form, or are we building these forms around the functionality of the dagger, but you also have people who are trying to be original and trying to be different, to make a name for themselves with new and novel ways of doing things that can be considered a genius interpretation of an established science, art, and philosophy.
which is certainly what Figgy's trying to say, isn't it? It's like, yeah, you're gonna say that I'm like way out there and crazy, but really this is the best bit. Eventually, you're gonna realize that I'm amazing, and that my way is right.
Yeah.
You see that, and that's that nod to the, oh yeah, you can do it the way everybody else does it, but listen, the way I've got it, so much better. I think it's really good to see that through all of them, it's got the daggers primarily defensive, and you're using it in the conclusion. They all pretty much say that, and
yeah,
that,
and you don't substantively change the way you use your sword.
Yeah.
Sorry, I walked all over you there.
To say the same thing, so it worked out perfectly. It all just feeds off the same, single sword principle.
So my follow-up question then, Lois, was, Tejero comes after the other authors. Is there a danger in thinking because he's had that time to think to come afterwards that it's necessarily a better way to use the dagger, or is that the wrong way to think about it?
It's tempting to think about it that way, but I don't think that's the correct way to approach it, because better is relative, right? If you take a look at the evolution of the sword between the mid-1500s through to the mid-1700s, Carranza and Pacheco, and to a degree, Carranza, Pacheco, Figueiredo, they're all talking about a way of fighting that uses a sword that is a bit heavier and broader. It looks more like a Bolognese small side sword, right? When you're fighting that way, when you're fighting with a side sword, trying to move that weight around with just an arm, a single arm, takes a different kind of effort. It's a different physicality. And then when you start getting into swept hilts with narrower blades, and then cup hilts with narrower blades. The blades themselves are more agile. They're longer, so cutting with them is now a bit more awkward and takes more time. Tejedo's method of defending, of using a dagger is better for his time. If there were a sudden resurgence of side sword use, then maybe Tejedo's method would no longer be better for that point in time. I think, it's like, it's a refinement, but that refinement is informed by a number of things, and it's not necessarily that, we've gone to internal combustion from steam because it's better. It's the technology, the ability to forge narrower blades in ways that those narrower blades are going to last long enough to be decent. And now we have to worry about people stabbing hands, so we got to change the shape of the guards. Oh, well, now that we're doing that, well, people are now much happier, keeping blades in contact and working in very tight circles. Oh, well, that changes the game. It changes the way things are played.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
If there aren't any further questions, I thought it might be useful, Lois. You did mention that this was a work in progress and you had plans for it as a workshop. Perhaps you wanted to just kind of take us through some of the things that you had planned, or
okay. No, I walked myself into that, didn't I? Yeah, if I had run this as a workshop, it would depend on the amount of time that I had, and it would depend on how many people I had. But I would get all of us to try Figgy, Viedma, and Tejido using either plays that are in the book. Viedma's pretty good about supplying plays. Or using our Figgy ones that we use at BSIS, and then maybe building a couple for Tejido, so that we can get a sense of how they work and why they work the way they work. And then the latter half, I had imagined I would bring everybody together and I'd say, all right, you, how do you fight? Oh, you like to fight Meyer. All right. I don't know anything about Meyer. Is there anything in the Dagger stuff that we've done that you think would be useful to you? Yes, no, yes. Great. Why? How would you use it? How would you adapt it to use for you? I'd love to see what the logic is behind what you would do. Is there anything that caught your eye? And then maybe some of the Italian fighters would be like, oh, that's really clever. We like the way that they're trying to get around some of our sneaky stuff. But now that we know it, we know how to get around it again. Great. How? Well, what are your thoughts? How does it look? The idea being just to get everybody thinking in those terms, to just sort of have a moment where we do some of the physical stuff to actually engage, use the weapons, but then we actually get to sit back and think. Have a think about how you can apply something, why you might apply something, and play. Just play. Just test out ideas. Maybe somebody would say, well, can we make some of this work with 2 daggers? Well, let's try it out. Let's see how it goes. Why the heck not? My ulterior motive there is generally Australian HEMA doesn't get this ugly. Occasionally it will. But I wanted to create a moment where all of us who come from different techniques and different traditions and different schools and different places could have a moment of just having a really great time with each other, seeing other schools, philosophical approaches, seeing their cleverness, seeing finding bits of wonder in everything, not only in just the style that we're really interested in, but seeing really great things coming out of other styles and other approaches. Because I really enjoy seeing that when it happens, so it's self-serving on my part. But,
Novice Italian perspective. The thing about having a Spanish fencer as an opponent is when they don't know how to use their Spanish techniques correctly. So they're so het up with what they're actually doing that they're not actually thinking too much about how their technique might be used to actually effectively defend themselves or attack.
Do you think that that's the case for any style?
Definitely.
If you get caught up in thinking how you should be doing something, you're not thinking about the fight.
Yeah, exactly. But the sophistication of Destreza, it appears to me that it tends to lend itself to that. Maybe that's just my novice.
No, I in terms of my own development in the style, I would agree. I still get caught up in my head.
I think one of the other things
it was interesting seeing the different dagger styles, and I was just imagining from an Italian perspective, how I would approach that and how to actually respond to that. I certainly wouldn't be doing this.
Right? Yeah.
Maybe, as you say, that's just the illustration. That's
He's in the middle of an action. That's actually in the middle of a, you know. But anyway, Sean has been trying to say something. Except I only see Sean's forehead now.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say that I think Distress is focused on acting on the cues. Whoa! Let me just throw my camera on the floor.
This sound better.
Allows you to be caught up thinking too much, rather than like a lot of the Bolognese system, and that they sort of just get you flowing through a series of actions, which has its own drawback too. If you get caught in a pattern or whatever, you start executing the entire sequence rather than realizing the cues. So I think as Julian says, it's something that most systems have when they start, but it sort of manifests in two different ways. You've got the flowing systems where you continue playing without reading the cues, and Distress is much more on like reacting to the cues. So sometimes if when you're becoming used to that, it's like indecision at viewpoint or not getting the cues until too late.
Yeah.
Ryan's also added that the lack of guards in Distrezza really narrows things down, though.
Yeah. Yeah, but it does then put the onus on you to figure out what you should be doing with your sword when you're confronting another opponent, which is one of my big fights. I usually make the horrific mistake of just sort of sitting there in guard, being like, haha, I have an impenetrable wall, you can't get me. Well, that's not fencing. That's me standing with my sword out in right angle, basically giving you the weak of my weapon to do whatever you want with.
Brian's also added the blade actions can get pretty fancy.
Yes.
I was just going to ask you, Lois, just on that point, do you find that when you have a dagger and you're doing Distrezza, do you find that you feel more free to move around, or does that impede you?
No, because I'm in the state that Julian describes when I'm using a dagger, because I'm still struggling to get Figgy dagger style to sit. Like I can't get myself to do it naturally. I still have to think way too hard about, oh, this has happened. I should be doing, I've been stabbed. Okay, all right, let's try again. This has just happened. I've been stabbed again. All right, let's try that again. I'm still thinking too much about how to apply the dagger. And I don't necessarily, the answer is to practice more, but I'm still thinking about ways where I can ask someone to help me set up a trigger drill so that, they'll do one of two actions and I have one of two responses based on those actions. And they'll take that action and I just practice doing the correct response, so that it starts to become a bit more ingrained. Because otherwise I'm like, oh, something's happened. Should I be decked down now? No, I need to get out. No, need to start again. Out of dodge. All right, let's try this again.
Also, in your opinion, out of the three authors, do you find one that is more accessible to someone who's not fought with a dagger before?
Viedma.
Mm-hmm.
Viedma is as straightforward as you can get. With Viedma, your major obstacle is just having the discipline to keep that dagger up here. Leave your dagger here. Don't goof with it. Just leave it here until you're going to use it. Figgy, I think, requires the most mental agility. And Tejedo's not too bad. But Tejedo is very, very, he's very insistent upon that equilateral triangle. And if you're not accustomed to maintaining that equilateral triangle, you're basically leaving a door open on yourself. So you have to practice keeping that triangle well formed, or you're not using it to its best ability.
Does he give any other examples of using it? Like he's talking about that one where you're stepping to the right and you're going to use it to deflect that strike. Stepping to the left and you're going to deflect the counter strike.
When you say he, who do you mean?
Who are you just talking about? Tuxedo, Tahir.
Tuxedo. I can't remember. Martin's also asked, is that Viedma Sword and Dagger straightforward or Viedma in general? I can't answer that question. I haven't studied Viedma deeply. I just sort of poked my nose in Sword and Dagger because I was interested in seeing the differences. So I'm going to hand that question off to somebody who has done a bit more of Viedma single sword to answer that question from Martin while I grab that bit of document for Decalo.
So that's either me or Ryan, probably.
Yeah.
I would suggest it's not terribly straightforward or simple, really. It's same kind of. It's got a lot of Pacheco's things. It's a little simplified in the reduction of the cuts. He really doesn't like cutting. It's all very thrusty, and
Yeah.
he tells you lots of things, and then it's like, now the student will do this day drill for 8 days. And you go, oh, good.
Yeah, right?
I'll read
It's
that
almost
one.
like a medical prescription. It's weird.
So I think if you were to work through and follow his plan and teach someone that way, I think that would build up a good fence really quickly. But for like accessing it in random points and dropping in bits, I don't think it's particularly easy.
All right, so
a lot of reading that with the pre-knowledge of the Checos, it's like, oh yeah, it's just a slightly different take on the same sort of thing.
yeah. I can tackle that tuxedo question. So when the translation comes out, and that'll be early next week, basically as part of a promotion, because I'm going to be doing a lecture, as far as I know about translating, but I'm not entirely certain yet. But anyway, in the translation, when it comes out, there are two sections that are highlighted in two different colors. The orangey color describes how to hold the dagger, and the greeny color talks about how to operate with the dagger. And I'll just read that now because it's not that long.
Oh.
So the examiner says, and if the enemy should take the Italian stance, how and when should the diestro use this equilateral triangle? And Tejero responds, the diestro should always be safeguarded by it without altering or diminishing it for any reason, unless one is being attacked. The posture I should take against the Italian stance is corresponding with my arm to the lower rectitude in accordance with the rectitude my opponent is in, which is in the rear rectitude, and the lower rectitude along with the side. Basically, that's what you in the illustration. He's just talking rectitudes and lines. And because of what the opponent has beneath the arm, I take the acute angle with my arm, with my sword in the obtuse. It's that posture that you see where it's showing both the strike above and then the strike to the leg. Enacted by the upper part of my wrist with the point of my sword in such a way that it points to the left eye of my opponent to leave them just one path to travel if they wish to strike me. And in this manner, I will have made another triangle formed by two physical lines, the sword and the upper part of my arm, and the third line from the point of my sword to my right shoulder, and my body weighted somewhat over the left foot, but only very little, so that when the opponent tries to strike me, I can take my stance or shift to my right foot to be ready to strike them, putting both of my weapons in contact with their sword. The triangle should be conserved even when I'm striking. It will also be to my advantage to have my body weighted a little left foot. So we're talking about a slightly rear stance, so that when the opponent doesn't resolve to feint, I can find my reach with greater brevity. Since I am not in the extreme, this was such a bastard of a phrase. Since I am not in the extreme of my right knee touching the left thigh, the actual Spanish on that is a headache. Basically, I think he's trying to tell people not to stand 100% on the rear foot. That phrasing. I don't have the inside of my right knee touching the left thigh. It's true that in this way, the right foot will be quicker to perform the will of its operator. Since the body is somewhat weighted over the left foot, the right foot has less weight on it, and with much more brevity, it can be lifted to move forward or to either side according to the most convenient direction, recentering immediately and equally over both feet to be in balance during the execution of the attack. This posture is represented in the following illustration, which is the page 80 illustration. And I will share that briefly so we can get a sense of it. And there you go. So that other triangle he was talking about is the scalene triangle here, which is basically, he's talking about a wedge that you've made for yourself that covers line coming to your upper half, and then you've covered your lower half with that dagger. And because this arm, because your hand is not all the way up at your shoulder, because it's a little lower, you have a better chance of covering upper and lower lines, or striking to an upper or lower line as is opened for you by the opponent.
And when he's talking about
Was that
there's a path for them to take to attack, he's talking about above both of your weapons, right? He's talking about on the high inside.
Yeah. I'm going to take a moment to have some water because, wow, talking dries you out.
Were there any other questions or comments? I mean, I think feel free to turn your mics and video cameras.
Yeah.
Going to have a bit of a discussion.
Yeah, feel free to.
I'll just say thank you, Lois, for that presentation today.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Chuck.
I hope it was interesting. If folks have questions, feel free to message.
Awesome. I think I'll just stop the recording there, and we'll just do the discussion.